Coming up on Arirang News, President Moon Jae-in meets with South Korea's top business leaders to discuss Japan's new restrictions on key tech exports. He pledges swift and decisive action to minimize the damage to local companies. South Korea condemns Japan's export curbs at the WTO, arguing that they go against free trade. Japan, meanwhile, holding firm and claiming it's well within its rights. And South Korea adds more than 250,000 jobs in June. More young people working too, but the data also show a rise in overall unemployment. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. There's been talk in the media that the Trump administration might be satisfied with a nuclear freeze by North Korea. But the State Department is clarifying that the goal is still the regime's complete denuclearization, and a freeze is just the start. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
The U.S. State Department has made it clear its goal is to seek a complete elimination of weapons of mass destruction in North Korea, beginning with a freeze on their production. Speaking on a press briefing on Tuesday, spokesperson Morgan Ortagus explained a nuclear freeze has never been the end goal of the Trump administration, and that U.S. President Donald Trump is committed to resolving the North Korean nuclear issue through diplomacy. She added a nuclear freeze is just the beginning of the process, signaling that the U.S. may be open to adopting a step-by-step approach to the North's nuclear dismantlement, starting with a freeze and ending with the complete scrapping of WMDs. Washington's previous stance has centered on the regime dismantling all of its nuclear and missile facilities before easing any sanctions. Her comments come after growing controversy following a New York Times report saying the U.S. could settle for a nuclear freeze in hopes it'll create a foundation for the next round of talks with Pyongyang. On the nature of the 50 or so minute meeting held between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un inside the Freedom House at the inter-Korean border village of Panmunjom late last month, Ortega said the meeting should not be regarded as a summit between the two leaders but an impromptu gathering. It's believed a third summit would take place if the bilateral working-level talks planned for this month go ahead and lead to progress. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Washington's top diplomat for the Asia-Pacific region is starting a 10-day tour of 4 Asian countries, including South Korea and Japan. That's David Stilwell, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. The State Department says it's his first trip in that capacity since he assumed his post last month. U.S. officials say he will meet with officials from Seoul's Foreign Ministry and the Presidential Office to discuss bilateral relations. Stilwell's trip comes as South Korea-Japan ties have reached new lows over Tokyo's export restrictions. China's ambassador to South Korea, Qiu Guohong, says Seoul and Beijing are on the same track when it comes to bringing peace to the Korean peninsula. Speaking at a forum Wednesday at South Korea's National Assembly, Qiu said China has always played a constructive role in the peace process, proposing feasible and practical solutions, and that it will continue those efforts. Regarding the latest three-way summit between the two Koreas and the U.S. at the DMZ, he said it was a symbol of hope, which gave a boost to the denuclearization talks. He said that the Korean peninsula is already on the road to peace and security, but it's still too early to tell whether the journey will be smooth. The Australian student recently deported by North Korea is saying he obviously never spied on the regime. On Twitter Tuesday, 29-year-old Alex Sigley rejected claims by North Korea that he published anti-state material on the website NK News. Sigley also said he'd like to continue his master's studies at Kim Il-sung University in the North Korean capital, an experience he said he loved. But he expressed regret he may never return and said he has no plans to go back in the near future. Sigley first visited North Korea in 2012. His family raised the alarm late last month when he went missing for over a week, after which North Korean state media reported he had been arrested for espionage. Now, there's a trade war, but things are tense between the U.S. and China militarily, too. Beijing is demanding that Washington cancel its proposed sale of more than $2 billion worth of arms to Taiwan. Hong Yu reports.
Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Gong Shuang said Tuesday that Beijing has filed a formal complaint with the U.S. State Department through diplomatic channels. It called on the U.S. to immediately cancel its proposed $2.2 billion arms sale to Taiwan. Beijing expresses strong dissatisfaction and resolute opposition to the proposed sale, calling it crude interference in Chinese internal affairs that harm China's sovereignty and security interests.
China urges the United States to honor its commitment to the One China principle and the Three China-U.S. joint communiques, immediately revoke its planned arms sales to Taiwan to avoid further damage to the China-U.S. relations and peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
According to the U.S. Defense Security Cooperation Agency, the proposed sale includes 108 Abrams tanks and 250 Stinger surface-to-air missiles to help Taiwan meet current and future regional threats by improving the security and defensive capability of Taiwan. The proposed sale still needs the approval of Congress, but it's very likely to be given the green light. Taiwan's foreign ministry said the arms sale will help boost its defensive capability. Experts expect a strong backlash from China if the sale goes through, further intensifying tensions between Washington and Beijing. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
In baseball, LA Dodgers pitcher Ryu Hyun-jin has made history, becoming the first South Korean pitcher to start an MLB All-Star Game. In Cleveland Tuesday, representing the National League team, Ryu threw one scoreless inning and allowed just one hit to the first batter, George Springer of the Houston Astros. Ryu finished the first half of the season with a record of 10-2 and a league-leading ERA of 1.73. And he's just the third South Korean pitcher to be chosen for the All-Star Game, following Park Chan-ho in 2001 and Kim Byung-hyun in 2002. President Moon Jae-in has called on Japan to end what he called its politically motivated export curbs. Meeting with around 30 Korean business leaders today, he said the government is doing its best to settle the issue diplomatically, but he also called for new measures to make South Korea more self-sufficient. Kim Mo-kyun reports.
President Moon Jae-in held his first face-to-face meeting with the heads of 34 local business conglomerates since Japan announced new export curbs targeting South Korea earlier this month. The president's stance on resolving the issue remains unchanged.
무엇보다 정부는 외교적 해결을 위해 최선을 다하고 있습니다. 일본 정부도 화답해 주기를 바랍니다. 더 이상 막다른 길로만 가지 않기를 바랍니다.
The president added that such a move is never desirable, given the two countries' long-established ties in security cooperation, and said that it will only serve to harm both economies. The president at the same time acknowledged the possibility that the situation could extend into the long term and called for necessary preparations. That includes a public-private emergency response system that would allow the government and businesses to better coordinate their actions. The president also proposed measures to make South Korea more self-sufficient and less reliant on high-technology imports.
근본적인 대책으로는 우리 주력 산업의 핵심 기술, 핵심 부품, 소재, 장비의 국산화 비율을 획기적으로 높여 해외 의존도를 낮추는 계기로 삼아야 할 것입니다.
As for short-term measures, the president promised to provide more support to expand domestic production of the restricted items and diversify their sources to help minimize damages to local firms. The president added that the budget necessary to fund R&D efforts will be reflected in the government's extra budget bill at the National Assembly. In regards to Tokyo's allegations that its hydrogen fluoride exports to South Korea had made its way illegally into North Korea, the president said the suspicions are groundless and said Japan should refrain from making further claims. Kim Mo-kyun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the South Korean government has raised the issue of Japan's export restrictions at the World Trade Organization, urging the Japanese government to withdraw them immediately. Japan, though, says what it's done is fine under WTO rules. Kim Yo-sun has more.
The South Korean government stressed Japan's new trade restrictions go against the principle of free trade, strongly condemning the move at a WTO meeting on Tuesday. While the issue was not on the agenda for the WTO Council for Trade Goods, Seoul raised it as an issue to be dealt with during the two-day meeting. Expressing regret over Tokyo's move, South Korea's ambassador to Geneva, Baek Ji-ah, called for the prompt withdrawal of the restrictions. The envoy also reiterated the grounds for such action claimed by Tokyo are invalid under WTO rules. The Japanese government insists its move is not a trade embargo, instead describing it as a necessary measure to review its export system in relation to its security. Tokyo also stressed the move does not violate its WTO obligations, adding it's just a change of procedure that had previously enabled Seoul to enjoy a simplified process. Seoul's envoy also warned the trade curbs would have repercussions for the global electronics industry, including Japan. The South Korean government also plans to raise the issue at a General Council meeting of the WTO, which is slated to take place in 2 weeks. Tensions between Seoul and Tokyo escalated over the recent days, following Japan's restrictions on exports of key high-tech components used to make semiconductors and display panels to South Korea. Such a move is seen as an apparent response to the South Korean Supreme Court's rulings, awarding compensation to victims of Tokyo's wartime forced labor by Japanese firms. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
A senior South Korean diplomat in charge of economic affairs is heading to the U.S. today to discuss the Japan trade restrictions. On Thursday local time, the Director General for Bilateral Economic Affairs, Kim Hee-sang, will meet with a senior official at the State Department. That's Roland DeMarcellis, acting Deputy's Assistant Secretary for International Finance and Development. Originally, they were going to meet to prepare for high-level economic talks between South Korea and the U.S., but now it's highly likely that they'll be talking about Japan, too. Kim's also scheduled to meet with Mark Napper, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan. It's time now for an in-depth look at the market action today, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Hwang Se-eun, Research Fellow at the Korea Capital Market Institute. Dr. Hwang, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me here today.
Wall Street overnight was mixed. Korean shares today recovering from the very rough couple of days they had earlier in the week. What's the story today?
As you mentioned, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell slightly Tuesday, notching a 3-day losing streak. Before the close, however, the Dow briefly turned positive. Investors awaited more clues to the Federal Reserve's next monetary policy move. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell is scheduled to testify in front of the House Financial Services Committee on Wednesday. Investors will be looking for clues on whether the Fed will cut rates later this month, as it is widely expected, or if the central bank thinks the economy is strong enough to maintain current monetary policy. Asian shares inched ahead on Wednesday, while higher Treasury yields lifted the dollar as markets wondered if the Fed would confirm or confound expectations for U.S. policy easing this month. South Korea's Kospi climbed 0.33%, but Japan's Nikkei lagged with a loss of 0.15%.
Now, the investment bank Morgan Stanley's lowered its growth forecast for the Korean economy from 2.2% down to 1.8%. Why is that? And then combined with everything else going on, is there a credit risk here for Korea?
International analysts are lowering Korea's growth rate projections for this year. Morgan Stanley slimmed it down to 1.8% from 2.2%, while ING Group and Nomura Securities lowered it to 1.5% and 1.8% respectively. Morgan Stanley said South Korean economy would be subject to additional downward pressure due to Japanese export restrictions. Morgan Stanley's growth rate projection is 0.6 percentage points lower than government's estimate. Korea is one of the countries most exposed to the uncertainties of U.S.-China trade disputes in Asia. In addition to this, Japanese economic retaliation against South Korea will increase the downward pressure on economic growth. Moody's, the global credit rating agency, also referred to the Korean-Japan trade dispute as an economic risk. If Japanese export restrictions make Korean economy, which is already sluggish, even worse, then the country credit rating on South Korea may be affected negatively. Downgrading is quite unlikely, but credit outlook can be revised in case of tension escalation.
Right, so maybe an outlook affected there. Now, on Tuesday, Korea denounced Japan's trade restrictions at the WTO, and it's also planning to bring it up at another WTO meeting later this month. Korea is saying the measures are retaliatory and that they go against the principle of free trade. What is the argument from the Korean side?
During a meeting of the WTO Council for Trade in Goods in Geneva on Tuesday, Seoul expressed regrets over Japan's curbs on exports of key materials used in semiconductors and displays. South Korea mentioned that Japan's export restriction measure is against only one single country, and it is inappropriate to take a retaliatory economic measure for political purposes. South Korea appears to be striving to secure backing from the international community, including the United States, to roll back Japan's trade measure, as its efforts to settle the diplomatic tussle bilaterally have made no headway. The restrictions on exports of the materials to South Korea could hit tech giants such as Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix that supply chips to the likes of Apple and Huawei. This implies that if the dispute between South Korea and Japan becomes stronger, then many of the global IT companies may have negative impact on their production activities due to problems in memory chips supply.
Got it. All right, Dr. Huang, that's where we'll have to leave it today. Thanks for coming on today. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much.
In other news, South Korean lawmakers are holding another Q&A session with government officials on this Wednesday with a focus on economic issues. Japan's restrictions on exports to South Korea is the main topic today. Lawmakers are trying to gauge the impact and called on the government to draw up countermeasures. Also likely to be brought up during the session is the efficacy of the government's proposed extra budget and its policy of income-led growth. The ruling party is expected to defend the government, saying it's doing what's needed to prop up the economy. But the opposition bloc will likely call for an overhaul, claiming those policies are driving the economy downhill. As mentioned, Morgan Stanley slashed South Korea's growth forecast for this year to 1.8%. That's a downgrade of 0.4 percentage points from its forecast in May and far less than the Korean Finance Ministry's forecast of between 2.4 and 2.5%. Morgan Stanley said Japan's export curbs could weaken growth even more by hurting South Korean companies' productivity and adding pressure to already slowing global trade. Most South Korean firms, it said, have an existing supply of the materials from Japan good for about 3 months. Some signs of improvement in South Korea's jobs market, with the number of newly employed people reaching a 17-month high in June. It's not all good news, though. The unemployment rate ticked up to 4%. Go Jun-hee has the details.
The latest report from the South Korean government shows the number of new jobs continues to be on the upswing. According to Statistics Korea on Wednesday, the number of employed people in South Korea in June was around 27.4 million, up 281,000 on year. The increase has surpassed the 200,000 mark for 2 months in a row and is the biggest rise since January 2018. Last month's uptick was mainly due to more new jobs being created in the health and social work sectors, which jumped by a combined 125,000. Analysts say this comes after the government created more public sector jobs in those fields. The employment rate among people aged 15 to 64 marked 67.2%, marking the highest for the month of June since data was first compiled in 1989. On a Zimmer note, the overall unemployment rate marked 4%, up from last June's figure of 3.7%. This is the highest for the month of June since 1999. As for the reason behind increases in both the employment and unemployment rates, Statistics Korea explained this means more people are looking for jobs as more are being created. Analysts also worry about a decrease in the number of jobs for people in their 30s and 40s, as they're supposed to be actively engaged in economic activities. On the contrary, the number in the group aged 60 or older continues to jump, this month by 372,000, which contribute the most to the overall number of new jobs. Breaking it down by sector, the number of jobs continues to decline on-year in the manufacturing sector, considered South Korea's main growth engine. The number of employed people fell 66,000 on-year, and it has been falling on-year since April last year. 고르니 아리랑 뉴스.
Hyundai Engineering and Construction has clinched a big order to build a gas and crude oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia. Oh Soo-young reports.
Hyundai Engineering and Construction will build a massive oil and gas processing plant in Saudi Arabia. The South Korean construction giant says it inked a $2.7 billion order from the Saudi Arabian oil company on Tuesday local time. The plant will be based in the northeast region of Marjan and is set to be completed by October 2022. The order consists of two projects. The first is building a $1.8 billion oil and gas processing plant. The second is installing additional facilities to provide electricity, industrial water, and other necessary utilities for the gas processing plant. Hyundai Engineering has completed orders for Aramco in 2009 and 2012 to build gas processing facilities in Kurais and Karan, worth $2.1 billion. The South Korean company is also currently working on Aramco's ethane deep recovery project in Uthmaniyah, which is set for completion in November this year. Hyundai says its latest deal came about from trust built on its previous contracts with Aramco and says it hopes to expand its operations to other Middle Eastern countries. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
The United States and China are set to relaunch their trade talks this week after a two-month break. The Trump administration is going to exempt a number of Chinese products from hefty tariffs, offering relief to some American firms which have said the taxes hurt their businesses. Lee Seung-jae reports.
The world's two biggest economies will finally resume trade talks following a two-month hiatus. This comes as Larry Kudlow, the director of the National Economic Council of the U.S. and a top economic advisor to President Trump, said last week that a face-to-face meeting was on the cards. Reuters reported Tuesday that negotiations will start as early as this week, with a phone call between U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He. The resumption of talks comes after the leaders of the two countries met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Japan last month, where Trump agreed to suspend a new round of tariffs on $300 billion worth of imported Chinese goods, while the two sides resumed negotiations. Hoping to further improve trade relations, the Trump administration agreed to exempt 110 Chinese products, from medical equipment to key capacitors, from hefty tariffs. The exemptions will also offer some relief to American firms, which say the taxes harm their business. Plus, in a surprise announcement Tuesday, U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said Washington will issue licenses to American companies seeking to sell goods to China's telecoms giant Huawei, so long as the sales pose no threat to U.S. national security. However, industry observers say the announcement failed to answer which products would meet the standard. In May, Huawei was placed on the U.S. Commerce Department's so-called entity list amid concerns it was spying for the Chinese government. U.S. parts and components generally cannot be sold to those on the list without special licenses. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Automaker BMW has announced it will make its first fully electric version of the iconic Mini at the company's Oxford plant in the UK. The German automaker had been considering moving plants out of the country in case of Brexit, but says it's committed to and invested heavily in its British production facilities. The Mini Electric could hit the streets as early as March 2020. Brexit has prompted BMW, though, to move some of its engine production out of the UK. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.